Welcome to the Interlocutor Podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskelson. Today I'm speaking with Mark Cancian. Mark is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Before that, he had more than a 30-year career in the U.S. Marines, serving in conflicts that ranged from the Vietnam War to Desert Storm and the Iraq War. He's published more than 40 articles on military operations, budgets, and strategy. Notable among them, a report entitled The First Battle of the Next War, Wargaming, a Chinese Invasion of Taiwan. He co-authored this wargame study with his son Matthew and the scholar Dr. Eric Hagenbotham. Mark Cancian, welcome, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So, may I ask about your background? Where did you grow up, and what were the circumstances that led you to joining the Marines?
Well, when I was in college, I decided that I wanted to do something different after college. I wanted to serve my country, and I was tired of writing 20-page papers. So I actually went to the Army first and asked about ROTC, but this was in the during the Vietnam War days, and the Army was getting kicked off campus. So they said, well, maybe the Marines have something. And so I went over to the Marine office, and they said, have we got a deal for you? And so they had a program where you would go 2 summers down to Quantico, Virginia for essentially boot camp, and that's what I did. And after I graduated from college, I went in the Marine Corps and served as an artillery officer, went overseas for the evacuation of Saigon, and stayed on active duty for 10, 11 years. Then went into the reserves for the following 27, but got called up for Desert Storm and then twice for Iraq. And at the end of the second tour, my wife said, okay, it's time to turn this over to a younger generation.
Mm-hmm. And so you were at college, at our university at that time. Was that Harvard University where you studied?
Yes, it was. I did my undergraduate work at Harvard and my graduate work at Harvard Business School.
Okay. And that was all finished before you joined the Marines?
No, actually, I went in after college and then did my first 2 tours in the Marine Corps, and I applied for what they called an advanced degree program. And so Harvard sent me to or rather the Marine Corps sent me to Harvard Business School, which was a great deal, and I got my GI Bill and my pay and allowances, so I lived quite comfortably, unlike many other graduate students who are living very austerely. And then after that I did a payback tour in Washington, D.C. at Marine Corps headquarters, and then in the Pentagon.
Right. So you recently published a report entitled The First Battle of the Next War, Wargaming, a Chinese Invasion of Taiwan. I'd like to start with a somewhat general question and ask, how are war games conducted?
Well, there are many different kinds of war games. Ours is probably what many people have in their minds when you think war game. It was a physical game. It had 3 maps. There were 2 operational maps, one for the United States and the coalition, one for the Chinese, and then there was a separate ground map for the combat on Taiwan itself. And there are pieces representing air squadrons, representing ships, representing ground forces, and the 2 sides move their pieces. There is a mechanism for adjudicating combat, and the flow of the game goes turn by turn. So it looks like what many people imagine. There's another variety of war game that you might call a seminar war game, and that is where people would get together around a table. They're presented with a situation. Maybe you have 2 sides, and they talk about what their reaction would be, and maybe they come back together and compare the 2 discussions, maybe go on to another move, another phase of simulation. But it's not on a board. It's not with rolling die and adjudication. It's really more like a seminar.
Mm-hmm. So, given the history with the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China and Taiwan, there's been hostilities, tensions between the two for many decades. Why do we believe that there's a window now where there's an elevated risk of China taking some action against the islands of Taiwan?
Well, the first thing that's happened is that the Chinese have built a very powerful military. In the 20th century, the Chinese military was ground focused. It was very large. It was not terribly well trained. It was based on large numbers of conscripts, and this has been the Chinese practice for centuries, really. But in the 1990s, the Chinese decided to build a new military and to expand its military. Part of that may have resulted from Taiwan crisis in the mid-1990s, where the United States moved some carriers close to Taiwan, basically showing China who was boss of the seas, and the Chinese reacted to that. Plus, it was a growing nationalism in China, so they started building a formidable Navy and Air Force, and that has unfolded over the last quarter century. They now have what is arguably the largest Navy in the world. They have a very powerful Air Force, and their ground forces are also quite modernized, although much smaller than they've been traditionally. And as a result, there's been a lot of concern about whether the Chinese might use this military force against Taiwan. Particularly in the last couple of years, President Xi has been very outspoken about Taiwan being part of the mainland and about the inevitability of reunification. He's built a strong nationalist following and made a strong nationalist appeal to the Chinese people. If you look at their movies, you can see it. You know, the two highest grossing movies in China one was about the Korean War and about the Chinese actually fighting the Marines in Korea, and the other one was about showdown in Africa between a Chinese special forces agent and Big Daddy, who was a U.S. contractor in Africa. So two things came together: building a very powerful military and the rhetoric to go with an aggressive foreign policy. The other thing that happened is the articulation of what's now called the Davidson window. Admiral Davidson, who was head of Pacific Command, said that the time between, say, 2026, 2028 would be particularly dangerous because the Chinese buildup was continuing, but the new U.S. capabilities that had been in development would not yet be fielded in numbers. So he saw this as a vulnerable time. Now, there's been a lot of argument about, whether, that window is just how vulnerable that window is, but there's no question about the possibility of a conflict, and that's the argument we make in our paper. We're not saying that conflict is inevitable, but we are saying it is plausible. As a thought experiment, if war broke out next week over Taiwan, no one would go, "Wow, didn't see that coming." No, everybody would say, "Yes, we've been talking about that for a long time."
What do you think are the parallels between Russia invading Ukraine and the potential PLA attack or blockade of Taiwan?
Well, there are some strong parallels. In both cases, you have this irredentism, that is, you have a major power who sees this other country as being rightfully a part of their territory. You have leaders who are very nationalists. You have leaders who have powerful militaries. One important difference is that Taiwan is an island, much harder to get to. With Ukraine, Russia just had to cross a land border, but to get at Taiwan, the Chinese have to cross the Taiwan Straits, 100 miles of water, and although 100 miles is not a long distance, it's still water, and you have to launch an amphibious operation, and those are extremely difficult.
Could you explain what AUKUS is and how it might contribute to security in the Pacific moving forward?
Yes, AUKUS is an agreement among Australia, the U.S., and the United Kingdom to strengthen ties between the three countries, and particularly to do two things. One is to build a conventionally armed nuclear submarine force in Australia, and the second is to facilitate technology cooperation and transfer among the three countries. So it is quite a step for Taiwan. This is rather for Australia. This is their largest defense acquisition program, I think, ever. It's very long term. It'll be the mid-2030s at least before the Australians have nuclear submarines. But it is a statement by Australia and also the United States and United Kingdom of confronting China and building capabilities to deter China and to enhance warfighting if necessary.
And there are several U.S. bases in Japan. There's a long-term security agreement between the United States and the Japanese. Is it inevitable that Japan has a big role to play in deterring a potential attack from China on Taiwan or security in general in the Pacific?
Yes.
Yeah.
Japan plays a major role in any conflict. Now, in the base case, that is the most likely case, Japan allows the United States to use its bases in Japan. The United States has several very large bases, including an important one on Okinawa, which is not far from Taiwan. But the Japanese don't participate themselves. And that was a assumption we ran by many senior Japanese officials, and they were all very comfortable with that. They said that that if the Japanese did not allow the U.S. to use its bases, then they would be tearing up this security agreement that they'd had for the last 70-odd years. And it was also the path of least resistance for the Japanese. That is, if they did nothing, that's what would happen. Their forces would not participate. The U.S. would use its bases. But the assumption also was that if the Chinese attacked the Japanese mainland, then the Japanese would come into the conflict. And that happened in, I think, 19 of the 25 iterations that we ran. So Japan frequently came into the conflict. And this got a lot of attention in Japan, first because it meant that they were going to be involved in this large conflict. But the other thing was that it was clear that the decision about war and peace for Japan was going to be made in Washington and Beijing, not in Tokyo. And that was, I think, caught the Japanese attention.
How are drones changing warfare? I read often about drone attacks or operations in the Ukrainian theater.
Yes. Well, looking at the Ukrainian theater, where we see this unrolling in real time, they've had a couple of really important impacts. On the ground war, small drones have had a major role. When people thought about drones and ground conflict, they mostly thought about predators, that is, fairly large aircraft that were used many times and that would fly around the battlefield as they had in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it turns out that they're very vulnerable, and many of them have been lost. What have been used in very large numbers is small drones, that is, expendable drones. And they're almost like guided artillery shells. You see pictures of them with small, maybe a mortar round or a hand grenade or something like that, and then they're flown first-person viewers, into an adversary's positions. The Ukrainians said that they were using 10,000 a month. And it doesn't mean that the other drones aren't important. Also, they've seen a lot of use. They've been doing a lot of spotting for the artillery. So they've been quite important in the conflict. And I think the extent of their use, particularly the small drones, has been a surprise. The large drones, I think people expected.
A recent headline that I read about was something like the Ukrainians wanted the neighboring Russian towns to feel the war as well, and that they were attacking into Russia. Moving back to the Taiwan-China potential conflict, in the war games you conducted, were there any attacks on mainland China, or was it more focused on the defense of Taiwan?
Well, it was both.
Both.
In the base case, we allowed the United States to attack the Chinese mainland. And mostly what the U.S. coalition player did was attack Chinese ports and ships in ports, and then sometimes airfields. Some players went after infrastructure targets, the way we're seeing in Ukraine, attacking electrical grid or something like that, but they quickly figured out that that was a diversion of military effort. In other words, it would have a long-term effect, if it had any effect, whereas the problem they were facing was this massive Chinese fleet off the shores of Taiwan, and they couldn't really spare military capability to attack other targets. So that was the base case. On the other hand, we ran many excursions where the U.S. was not authorized to attack the mainland because many people worry that if the United States does that, the Chinese, of course, are a nuclear-armed power, and as a result, this might escalate into the use of nuclear weapons. So we played it both ways. And that was a result of talking to a lot of officials and former officials here in Washington, D.C. When you talk to people in the Pentagon or who've come out of the Pentagon, they're quite adamant that, yes, the United States will be authorized, the armed forces will be authorized to attack the Chinese mainland. You go talk to the White House and the State Department, and they're quite the opposite. They say, no, it's too risky. The possibility of escalation is not worth it. So, no, we would not be authorized. As a result, we played it both ways.
It's somewhat reminiscent of the conflict that Douglas MacArthur had with Truman back during the Korean War. He wanted to attack into China, and Truman was against that for political reasons, right?
And you could certainly imagine a similar showdown between the military leadership and the political leadership. If the United States was getting pummeled at sea by Chinese missiles that were firing from the mainland, by aircraft that are flying out of bases, and if those are essentially in sanctuary, many military commanders are going to be jumping up and down saying, hey, we have to go after those. They cannot be firing at us from these safe spaces. On the other hand, you could certainly see the political leadership taking the same position that Truman did, and that as a result you have this kind of showdown.
There was something I read about the vulnerability of fighter aircraft. A lot of them are vulnerable. Let me rephrase that. They're vulnerable to attack, and a lot of them were lost before they ever got up into the air. And you talk about dispersion techniques and fortifying shelters as a way to mitigate against those vulnerabilities.
That's right. One surprising outcome was that 90% of the U.S. and coalition aircraft losses were on the ground, and that occurred because the Chinese have such a large missile inventory that periodically they would sweep the airfields in Japan and on Guam and destroy dozens of aircraft, so that by the end of the game there were literally hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. So we recommended two things. One was dispersion, and the Air Force has done a lot of that. They have something called ACE, to help disperse aircraft to more airfields, and that makes a lot of sense. We recommended that the Air Force continue to do that and to expand the airfields that it's looking at, particularly including Japanese civilian airfields, which would, of course, are very large and would give that many more places where you could spread the aircraft out. We also recommended that the Air Force build hardened shelters. During the Cold War, the United States built a lot of these, so did the Japanese. We stopped at the end of Cold War. We have not built any since then, and our argument to the Air Force is that if they want to operate out of any of the large bases, they've got to put in hardened shelters, or any aircraft there will be extremely vulnerable. We were very surprised to find out that Guam the big Air Force base on Guam, Anderson, has no hardened shelters. So any aircraft that's stationed there is just going to be out in the open, for exposed to Chinese missile attacks. So we recommended that very strongly. The Air Force has not picked up on that. Their answer is dispersion.
Mm-hmm. I recently spent some time in the Taiwan Strait. I visited islands called Jinmen, Penghu, and a little bit to the north, the Matsu Island group. And
Yep.
the weather there was tempestuous. I experienced perhaps the strongest winds I've ever felt in my life. How did climactic conditions factor into your war games?
We assumed that the Chinese would pick, the season of most favorable weather. I think that's June. But the weather does change, and it is important because that's right. If you were trying to launch an invasion with the kind of weather you were describing, that would be extremely difficult. But as I say, there are weather windows when an invasion is more favorable.
In the 3 weeks of combat around Taiwan, the projected American losses were at 3,200. And this gets into one of the things that first interested me about learning more about Taiwan was, would the American public or Western public be willing to endure the cost of getting involved in a conflict like this? And on the flip side, would the cost be worse if we did nothing?
Well, let me give two answers there to your questions. The first one is that yes, the casualties are very high and in a very concentrated time frame. The United States takes 3,200 killed and then about 10,000 wounded. That's maybe half of what the U.S. suffered over 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in this case in 3 weeks. And in fact, that's a floor because we don't count any casualties that occurred in the South China Sea. We abstracted that fighting there. And 3 weeks isn't the end of the war either. The war would typically go on for many more weeks. So yes, it would be far bloodier than the United States has experienced since arguably World War II. Whether the U.S. public would endure this is hard to say. Now, we're looking at a narrow window here where the conflict begins by China attacking U.S. forces. So I think we would have at least an initial surge of support for military counter action. Now, whether U.S. Population would accept this over the long term, of course, we're seeing fatigue in Ukraine as we did in Afghanistan. That's hard to say, but that was outside the time frame of the game.
Mm-hmm. So my last question for you today is about the imperative of deterrence. To be deterred, China must doubt its ability to prevail through armed forces. So could you talk about how important deterrence is over the next few years as hopefully what's going to happen?
Well, we certainly hope that this is a war we never fight. And
right.
we've made the point to many people who look at the game and say, well, we win, so what's the big deal? And we say, well, we win at extremely high cost. This is a conflict that we need to deter. And if it can't be deterred, we need to bring it to a conclusion more quickly. So we need to do a variety of things to strengthen our position in the Western Pacific. And the report lays out a number of those things. On the other hand, we do point out that stuff happens. Countries will make decisions to go to war, weighing factors in a way that we would not. We've seen that in Ukraine, for example, that Putin launched an invasion when nobody thought that it was rational or reasonable, but he did it anyway, weighing the factors differently. Countries may believe that the military balance is moving against them, for example. You saw that in at the beginning of the Second World War, where the Japanese decided to attack the United States. The United States, in thinking about a future war with China, looked at it and said, hey, that Japanese would be, or the United States looking at a future war with Japan, thought that it would be crazy for the Japanese to attack the United States. The United States was much larger, much more powerful, and the Japanese knew that. I mean, they weren't, under any illusions about the strength of the United States. They felt that they had no choice because of the oil embargo, and thought that if they hit the United States really hard at the beginning, that might discourage the United States long enough for them to dig in on a defensive perimeter. So they launched the attack. It was as disastrous as the United States had expected, but the Japanese did it anyway. So the bottom line is, stuff happens. So we have to be ready for the failure of deterrence, even as we work to strengthen it.
Great. Well, this war game study and report is called The First Battle of the Next War, Wargaming a Chinese Invasion of Taiwan. It's written by my guest today, Mark Cancian, his son, Matthew Cancian, and also a third scholar named Dr. Eric Hagenbotham. So, Mark Cancian, I really appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.